Imagine this. You walk into a hospital in Dallas, Texas for a routine surgery. You're nervous but hopeful. You've been told this young neurosurgeon is the best. He promises he'll fix your spine, end your pain, and give you your life back. Now imagine waking up to find you can't move your legs. Imagine your loved one never waking up at all. This wasn't one tragic mistake. It happened again, and again, and again. The man in the white coat wasn't saving lives. He was destroying them. Over 30 patients, maimed, paralyzed, or dead. All at the hands of a single doctor. His name was Christopher Duntsch. But history remembers him by another name. Dr. Death. How could this happen in America, a country with one of the most advanced medical systems in the world? How could a man walk into surgery after surgery, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives without being stopped? To understand the nightmare, we have to start at the beginning. Christopher Daniel Duntsch was born on April 3, 1971, in Montana and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. On the surface, he seemed destined for success. He was smart, ambitious, and determined to make his mark. He earned a football scholarship at Colorado State University, though his athletic dreams didn't last long. After realizing he wasn't destined for the NFL, Duntsch shifted his focus to academics, eventually setting his sights on medicine. He studied at the University of Memphis before entering medical school at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. There, he earned both an MD and a PhD, a rare achievement that should have marked him as one of the most promising young doctors in America. He specialized in neurosurgery, one of the most challenging and respected fields of medicine. His colleagues described him as confident, charismatic, even brilliant. But confidence has a dangerous twin, arrogance. And from the very beginning, Duntsch's ambition was laced with something darker. During his training, some supervisors noticed troubling signs. He sometimes skipped rounds. He seemed more focused on research and business opportunities than on patient care. Whispers circulated about his judgment in the operating room. Yet, in a system that often rewards boldness and overlooks red flags, those whispers were drowned out. By 2010, Duntsch moved to Dallas, Texas, ready to begin his career as a spine surgeon. He presented himself as a cutting-edge specialist, promising life-changing results to patients who had suffered for years with back problems. His resume sparkled. He spoke with absolute certainty. To many, he seemed like the answer to their prayers. But behind the polished smile and white coat was a man unfit to hold a scalpel. And soon, patients who trusted him with their lives would pay the price. The first signs came quietly. A slipped nerve here. An unusual amount of blood loss there. Complications that other surgeons whispered about but hesitated to report. In medicine, mistakes happen. No surgeon is perfect. But with Duntsch, the mistakes weren't rare. They were constant. Catastrophic. And instead of slowing down, instead of taking responsibility, Duntsch doubled down. He operated with reckless confidence, cutting through tissue and nerves as though the consequences didn't matter. The hospitals that hired him faced a choice. Should they stop him, and face lawsuits, financial loss, and public scrutiny? Or should they quietly let him go, passing the problem along to someone else? Most chose silence. And in that silence, Dr. Death kept cutting. The second act of Christopher Duntsch's story is not about ambition. It's about devastation. Patient after patient stepped into the operating room believing they were on the verge of healing, and instead walked out broken, scarred, or never walked again. Take Jerry Summers, one of Duntsch's closest friends. Jerry trusted him completely. When he went under the knife in 2011, he believed he was in the safest hands possible. Instead, Jerry woke up paralyzed from the neck down. His life was shattered in an instant. Imagine that for a moment. Your best friend. The man you trust above all others. And he leaves you unable to move. Unable to live the life you once knew. Jerry remained loyal at first, even defending Duntsch, but deep down, the betrayal was undeniable. And Jerry was only the beginning. There was Kellie Martin, a vibrant schoolteacher. She went in for routine surgery in 2012. She never came out alive. Her husband was told it was a complication. But other doctors knew the truth. The mistakes were egregious, avoidable, and fatal. Then came Mary Efurd, a 74-year-old woman who walked into the hospital for surgery on her back. After Duntsch's scalpel, she left in a wheelchair. When other surgeons later reviewed what he had done to her spine, one of them was horrified enough to call it, quote, butchery. And still he was allowed to keep working. Why? Because hospitals feared lawsuits. They feared losing money. They feared admitting the truth, that they had hired a man who should never have been allowed near an operating room. So instead of stopping him, they quietly pushed him out. He would leave one hospital and find another willing to take him on. With each move, the body count grew. In Plano, Texas, Floella Brown went in for surgery. During the operation, Duntsch sliced an artery. She suffered a massive stroke and died. Another patient, Jeff Glidewell, narrowly survived after Duntsch left a surgical sponge inside his neck and cut into his esophagus. By now, whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams. Nurses, anesthesiologists, and other surgeons who worked alongside Duntsch saw the destruction firsthand. Some begged administrators to intervene. Others kept silent, afraid of retaliation, afraid of lawsuits, afraid of what speaking up might cost their careers. And so, patient after patient fell victim to a man who seemed less like a surgeon and more like a predator. But here's the terrifying question that still lingers. Was this incompetence or intent? Because with Duntsch, it wasn't just mistakes. He operated with reckless disregard. He ignored warnings mid-surgery. He dismissed colleagues who tried to intervene. At times, it seemed he was experimenting, or worse, that he didn't care at all. One colleague remembered him saying chilling words, "Everybody's going to know who I am." And they did. But not for the reasons he wanted. By 2013, the Texas medical community could no longer ignore the disaster. Lawsuits piled up. Families demanded answers. The Texas Medical Board launched an investigation, but it moved slowly. Too slowly. Months passed. Victims mounted. And still Duntsch was not stopped. It took years too long for the system to finally turn on him. But in those years, the damage was already irreversible. Dozens of lives destroyed. And a haunting realization settled over America. The system meant to protect patients had failed, spectacularly. By 2013, whispers about Dr. Christopher Duntsch had grown into a roar that could no longer be ignored. Families were devastated. Other doctors were horrified. And the Texas Medical Board, slow, reluctant, drowning in bureaucracy, finally had to act. But the problem was this: medical boards are not courts. Their focus is licenses, not justice. Their power ends at stopping a doctor from practicing. And even that sometimes comes too late. In Duntsch's case, it was far too late. The numbers were staggering. More than 30 patients maimed, paralyzed, or killed in just 2 years. Colleagues described his surgeries as chaos in the operating room. Nurses whispered that he seemed impaired at times, slurring his words or unable to focus. One scrub technician recalled thinking he looked as though he hadn't slept in days, or worse, that he was under the influence. Still, for months he walked free. It wasn't until Dr. Randall Kirby, a respected Dallas surgeon, took action that the tide began to turn. Kirby had seen Duntsch's handiwork firsthand while trying to repair the damage he left behind in patient after patient. What he saw was not normal. Not acceptable. Not forgivable. Kirby wrote a scathing letter to the Texas Medical Board. In it, he said plainly what so many had tiptoed around. Duntsch is a sociopath. He is a clear and present danger to every patient he comes across. That letter was a spark in the darkness. It forced the board to dig deeper. To admit what so many already knew: this man was not just reckless. He was dangerous. Finally, in 2013, the Texas Medical Board revoked his license. Duntsch could never practice medicine again. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Revoking a license doesn't erase the harm already done. It doesn't bring back the dead or give movement back to the paralyzed. And it doesn't send a dangerous man to prison. For that, law enforcement had to step in. In Dallas County, prosecutors faced a challenge unlike any they'd seen before. How do you put a doctor on trial for murder when the operating room was his battlefield? Malpractice suits are common. Criminal charges against a surgeon? Almost unheard of. But this case was different. The prosecutors studied every file, every victim, every scar left behind. They weren't just building a malpractice case. They were building a case for assault. For harm. For intent. They zeroed in on Mary Efurd, the 74-year-old woman who had entered the hospital hoping for relief and instead left in a wheelchair. Her surgery had been so catastrophically botched that another surgeon described it as attempted murder. That phrase became the cornerstone. In 2015, nearly 3 years after his last surgery, Christopher Duntsch was arrested. He was charged not just with malpractice, not just with negligence, but with intentionally harming patients. The first doctor in American history to face life in prison for crimes committed in the operating room. The trial began in Dallas in 2017 and it gripped the nation. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in chilling detail. The trail of victims, the reckless incisions, the ignored warnings, the destroyed lives. Witnesses described him as indifferent, cold, even smug. Survivors rolled into the courtroom in wheelchairs. Family members held up photographs of loved ones who never came home. The defense argued incompetence, not intent. They said Duntsch was overconfident, poorly trained, perhaps impaired by drugs. But prosecutors hammered one point: this was not just incompetence. This was criminal. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear: guilty. Christopher Duntsch was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2045. He would be nearly 75 years old before ever having a chance to walk free. For the victims, it was not enough. Nothing could undo the years of suffering, the lives lost, the trust shattered. But for once, a system that had failed so spectacularly finally delivered a measure of justice. And for America, the case of Dr. Death was a wake-up call. When the words "guilty" rang out in the Dallas courtroom in 2017, there was a moment of silence. Survivors held their breath. Families clutched photographs of loved ones. And for the first time, the man who had walked into operating rooms with the power of life and death in his hands was stripped of that power forever. Christopher Duntsch was sentenced to life in prison. A punishment that, in the history of American medicine, was virtually unprecedented. Doctors had lost their licenses before. They had been sued, fined, disgraced. But this was different. This was the first time a surgeon was locked away for life for what he had done in the operating room. Yet for many, justice still felt incomplete. Because while Duntsch's crimes were monstrous, the truth is, he did not act alone. Not directly but indirectly. Hospitals that ignored the warnings. Administrators who quietly let him go, sending him on to the next operating room. Systems designed to protect reputations and revenue rather than patients. At least 33 patients suffered under his scalpel. And each one of those cases raises a haunting question. How many could have been saved if someone had spoken up sooner? The story of Dr. Death is not just about one man. It is about a system that allowed him to exist. And it forces us as Americans to ask hard questions. How do we protect patients in a country where hospitals often operate like businesses, where profit can sometimes weigh heavier than safety? How do we create a culture where doctors are held accountable not only by lawsuits but by the law? These are not questions for historians. They are questions for us, today. Because the truth is, Duntsch is not the only one. Across America, stories have emerged of doctors who harmed patients, through negligence, arrogance, or greed. And too often, accountability came only after lives were destroyed. But Duntsch's case changed the conversation. His conviction set a precedent, a line in the sand. It told doctors everywhere, the operating room is not a shield. If you abuse your power, if you harm instead of heal, the law can and will follow you. For the families of victims like Kellie Martin, Jerry Summers, Floella Brown, and Mary Efurd, that message came too late. But for future patients, it may save lives. And that, perhaps, is the only small piece of good to come from this nightmare. Today, Christopher Duntsch sits in a Texas prison cell. Once a rising star, once a man who dreamed of revolutionizing medicine, now a cautionary tale whispered in medical schools and hospitals across the nation. His name is etched into history not as a healer but as a warning. And yet, his story lives on, not just in court records but in podcasts, documentaries, and television dramas. Americans cannot stop asking, how did this happen? Could it happen again? The uncomfortable answer is yes. It could. If we do not remain vigilant, if we do not hold power accountable, if we do not demand transparency from those we trust with our lives, history could repeat itself. That is why telling this story matters. Not just to remember the victims. Not just to condemn one man. But to shine a light on a system that must be watched, questioned, and held accountable. And that, my friends, is where you come in. If you are watching this video, it means you care about stories like this. Stories that reveal the hidden cracks in our society, stories that demand attention. So I ask you, stay engaged. Share this story. Talk about it. Ask the hard questions. Because the legacy of Dr. Death is not just about the past. It is a warning for the future. And if we ignore it, we risk letting silence become permission. This is not just entertainment. This is history. This is truth. This is a lesson that should never be forgotten. So, if you found value in this story, if it opened your eyes, if it made you think, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Share this video. The more voices join in, the harder it becomes for stories like this to be buried. We owe it to the victims. We owe it to ourselves. And we owe it to the future. Because the story of Dr. Death is not just his story. It is ours.